And that magic phrase, eligible for discount, is a term of art that appears in the Act, narrowing the original mandate of the Fed to lend only against short-term, unquestionably good commercial securities of the highest quality. Okay? Originally, by the way, the Federal Reserve was prohibited from making loans to the Treasury. It was prohibited from taking Treasury paper as security for loans to the banks. So it was not until after we got involved in World War I under the First and Second Liberty Bond Acts in 1917 that the statutes were changed, giving the Fed the power to both buy government securities in the open market and to make loans to banks secured by government paper. It's from that tiny acorn that the great expansion of the monetary base has occurred since 1913. Back to Section 13.3 and the emergency powers again. So with Bear Stearns, you were dealing with one of the largest clearing brokers for derivative transactions in the market. Does anyone know the name of Bear Stearns' main clearing bank for those transactions? J.P. Morgan Chase. And who was it that bought Bear Stearns in the insolvency proceeding? J.P. Morgan Chase. The cynical view of that transaction was that it was a means to avoid having J.P. Morgan mark to market and account for the real value of all the derivative transactions that J.P. Morgan was clearing for everybody, not just Bear Stearns. 6 months later, Lehman went down. An auction was held later to settle the derivative obligations that were piled up with Bear Stearns. And eventually about $450 billion of derivatives were settled for about $6 billion cash that actually had to change hands. There's not enough time to get deeply into derivatives here today, but you can see me or talk to me afterward. But I think derivatives are just gambling bets. The analogy I use is it's like the old basketball movie White Men Can't Jump, starring Wesley Snipes and Woody Harrelson. And in that movie, there's a street basketball game, and you're looking over on the sideline, you see these two gentlemen standing on the sideline exchanging $5 bills back and forth as the players run up and down the court and score 2 points. They were betting on who's going to score the next 2 points. So not only did they presumably have a bet on the outcome of the game, which in a gambling context might make some sense, but to have more juice and more action, they were betting on the next 2 points. Well, derivatives are like those side bets that have nothing to do with the outcome of the game, but they're all about, in the next time period, who's going to score the next 2 points. And I can't for the life of me understand why the real resources of the American economy should be put at risk or put on the line to help guarantee the solvency of those making those $2 to $5 side bets. Now, Washington is Washington. If you've ever read Tom Clancy novels or a few John Grisham novels, I'll tell you one joke about that. Some of you have seen the movie or read the book, The Pelican Brief. And when the movie came out about 15 years ago, it starred Julia Roberts and Denzel Washington. So it came out while I was still teaching. I used to be an adjunct professor at Cleveland Marshall College of Law here in town in Cleveland State. And so when the movie came out, one of the law students asked me what I thought of the movie. And I said, I thought it was a pretty good and accurate depiction of the way Washington really works, except there were 3 factual errors in the movie. The CIA was portrayed as more or less straight. The FBI was portrayed as more or less straight. And the Washington Post reporter was honest and aggressive. it's on that latter point that I'll come back to this 13.3 argument. There have been a few faint, I think Professor Ed Kane of Boston College, a great man who should win the Nobel Prize but hasn't yet in economics. Professor Kane says that the Fed is like a basketball player like Kobe Bryant, who's very good at head fakes. He'll fake you off thinking you're going in one direction while meanwhile he goes in the other direction. And the Fed's engaged in quite a bit of head fakery lately, and through the members of the press that it likes to encourage and keep on its short tether. The Fed has occasionally allowed the 13.3 story, these bailouts in the fall a year ago, to be dealt with to some extent. I mentioned that originally 13.3 would have limited the Fed to making emergency loans secured only by the finest quality commercial assets. So how did they wind up making loans to Bear Stearns and AIG secured by derivatives? And the answer was that in 1991, in an episode in which I played a personal role, on the other side, I lost on this one, in the dark of night at a Senate markup session, when the 91 Banking Reform Bill, the FDIC Improvements Act, was going to final resolution. In the Senate markup, Senator Christopher Todd introduced a provision that had never been debated, hadn't been on the floor before. And it would amend that language in 13.3 to say, let's cut it off after secured to the satisfaction of the Reserve Bank period. So the stuff about only high quality assets being taken was taken out of the statute. In that session, somebody asked, can you explain this provision, Senator Todd? And he couldn't, because the provision had been drafted by a lobbyist. Well, it was presented to Todd by a lobbyist for the Securities Industry Association, who in turn had received it from a prominent member of the Securities Industry Association, who's still very big and active today. And that provision in turn had been drafted by the lead outside counsel for that prominent member of the Securities Industry Association. And so it was essentially just handed up 2 or 3 persons removed to Chris Todd, and he put it in the bill. So they said, Todd, can you explain it? He said, no, I can't. Senator Cohen of Maine, who later became Bill Clinton's defense secretary, was in the room, and he said, I think I can explain it. And the gist of the explanation was, the investment banks would like this provision in there because in an emergency, remember that Drexel Burnham had failed and been liquidated about 2 years earlier. In an emergency, the Fed would lack the power to provide any great deal of emergency assistance to a failing investment bank because they don't tend to hold the highest quality commercial assets the way a commercial bank originally did. Instead, they have stocks and long-term corporate bonds and things that the Fed would be prohibited from taking under this statute. So it was any asset satisfactory to the Fed. That's the new language. Okay? And that's how it came through. We who were pushing for the reform bill, the main thrust of the reform bill was to stop the Fed from making loans to banks that were already insolvent, which they had been doing in Texas and in the Bank of New England case. And the net effect of the Fed making a loan to an insolvent bank is just to increase the eventual loss to the FDIC. The Fed takes the best collateral as security for its loans, and the FDIC has to buy those loans back from the Fed when it tries to get assets to offset the deposits that the FDIC has to pay off.